Hello, how are you all doing? I hope you're doing well. Today, I have a story for you, a rather peculiar one. What would happen if Senku were reincarnated into a world of magic? I know what you're thinking, but Senku is a man of science. And you're right. But if there's one thing that defines every true scientist, it's their curiosity, that uncontrollable desire to discover, experiment, and understand everything unknown. And if there were a world where magic defied every law he knew, do you really think Senku would just sit idly by? Of course not. So come along with me to find out. What would have happened if Senku had been reincarnated into another world? It all began the day the world was meant to turn to stone. I still remember that moment with absurd clarity. I was walking along just like any other day when suddenly a green flash covered the sky. I didn't have time to react. The light hit me head on, and I felt my body begin to harden, starting from my feet. Petrification. It had begun. The strange thing was, even as my body stopped responding, my mind remained wide awake. So I did the only thing I know how to do when faced with the unknown. I started to analyze it. The speed of propagation increases as it advances. Interesting. As the stone crept up my legs, across my chest, and finally to my neck, I began counting every fraction of a second. 1, 2, 3. I needed to memorize everything. If I survived, that information could prove invaluable. The stone reached my face. My vision began to fade to black. But just when I expected it all to end, something impossible happened. I saw no darkness. I heard no silence. I felt something tearing me away. It was as if my consciousness had been forcibly ripped from my body. For an instant, there was no up or down, no time or space, only an absolute void. And then I opened my eyes. The first thing I saw was a wooden ceiling. It wasn't my laboratory, nor my bedroom, nor any place I had ever seen before. My breathing quickened for a moment, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking has never solved a scientific problem. I slowly moved my hand in front of my face. 5 fingers. No signs of stone. No cracks. I turned my head toward a mirror leaning against the wall, and that was when I froze. The face staring back at me in the reflection looked remarkably like mine. The same spiky hair, the same sharp eyes. But it wasn't me. I was a few years younger. I was dressed in elegant clothing, befitting a noble, and for some reason, my mind was filled with memories that didn't belong to me. A name, a family, a magic academy, and a completely different life. In that moment, I realized this wasn't a dream, nor was it a hallucination. I had left my world behind and awakened inside someone else's body. What I didn't yet know was that this world concealed a lie that had ruled over all of humanity for centuries, and I was about to turn it into my next experiment. The first thing I felt upon waking wasn't fear. It was a massive flood of information pouring into my mind all at once. Thousands of memories, but none of them were mine. I closed my eyes for a moment and let everything settle. A name, Adrián Valmont, 16 years old, son of a noble house, though calling it noble was giving it too much credit. His family occupied the lowest rung of the entire aristocracy, enough to keep the surname, but not the respect. As I sorted through those memories, something caught my eye. On the table, right next to the bed, there was a crystal goblet. It still held a bit of liquid at the bottom. The smell was unmistakable. Poison. I picked up the goblet and held it against the light streaming through the window. I didn't even need to taste it. Adrian's memories filled in the final pieces of the puzzle. He'd decided to take his own life. That was when a smile spread across my face. What a dramatic way to give up. I suppose, technically, this body was destined to die anyway. I calmly set the goblet back down on the table. Well, this world is getting quite interesting. I slowly got out of bed and began to look around the room. Fine clothes, books, maps, a uniform I had never seen before. Everything confirmed the same conclusion. I wasn't dreaming. I had truly arrived in another world. And if I learned anything in my life, it was that before jumping to conclusions, you have to gather information first. Because if Adrian had chosen poison over going on with his life, it meant the real problem was still out there, waiting for me. And I was absolutely certain that it wouldn't take long for me to encounter it. I had barely finished inspecting the room when the door burst open. "Adrian!" A girl walked in without even knocking. She was breathing heavily, as if she had run all the way across the mansion. Pure reflex made me look her over from head to toe. Dark hair, reddish eyes, academy uniform. And then, Adrian's memory stirred. Lilith, his only friend. Or rather, the only person who had never treated him like a useless failure. What are you still doing here? Today is the entrance exam. If we're late, you'll be disqualified. And if you fail this time, you'll be expelled for good. I looked at her for a few seconds without answering. She wasn't exaggerating. The memories confirmed every word she said. It was Adrian's last chance to stay at the Magic Academy. Lilith looked ready to drag me out by force. Meanwhile, I was busy processing other, far more interesting information. Magic Academy. Now that was something I hadn't expected. Without saying a word, I grabbed the uniform hanging by the wardrobe and calmly began putting it on. Lilith kept pressing me. Why are you so calm? Everyone says you're going to fail. I finished adjusting my uniform's collar. I turned toward her, and I couldn't help but smile. What are you waiting for? Lilith blinked in confusion. Huh? Let's go. It's time to show those Neanderthals what science is really all about. She kept staring at me, completely bewildered. She probably thought the poison had affected my brain. And to be honest, I couldn't blame her. After all, I never imagined I was about to enter an academy where thousands of people had been studying magic for centuries without understanding a single thing about how it worked. As we walked toward the academy, I couldn't help but notice Lilith glancing at me out of the corner of her eye. Again and again. Every time I turned my head, she would look away, acting as if nothing had happened, until finally she sighed. Hey, I stopped for a moment. What is it? She tilted her head slightly and smiled with that teasing look only true friends have. I don't know what you did this morning, but you look different. Much more confident. Much more like yourself. Though, honestly, I don't understand any of the weird things you say. She stepped a little closer as we kept walking. By the way, what is this science thing? I couldn't help but smile. It was a word completely unknown to this world. I looked up at the vast blue sky above us before answering. Science is the path to making the impossible possible. Lilith frowned. It was clear she hadn't understood a thing. But even so, she nodded, as if willing to give it a try. She was definitely an interesting girl. After a few minutes, we arrived at the massive Magic Academy building. It was even bigger than Adrian remembered. Giant columns, flags waving with the kingdom's emblem, and an endless line of young people waiting for their turn. There were boys and girls of all ages. Some were taking deep breaths to steady their nerves. Others were reviewing their notes one last time. And a few walked with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. I observed every detail closely. I wasn't looking at the students. I was studying the system, because an exam always reveals far more about the person who designed it than about the people taking it. And for some reason, I had a feeling this exam wasn't meant to discover talent, but rather to hide the truth. As soon as I stepped into the room, someone blocked my path. Well, well. So, you actually decided to take the exam after all. I looked up, completely unruffled. The moment I saw his face, Adrian's memories instantly stirred. Fabius, the guy who had made Adrian's life a living hell. Humiliations, beatings, mockery, all because he enjoyed feeling superior. I studied him for a few seconds, trying to recall his name. You were Fabius, right? He smirked arrogantly, but before he could answer, I stuck my little finger in my ear and cleaned it out with total indifference. You aren't worth my time. I pulled my finger out and looked at him with utter contempt. You're too stupid to even catch my attention. The whole room fell silent. Lilith's eyes went wide. I'm pretty sure Adrian would never have dared to speak to him like that. For an instant, I saw Fabius's smile vanish. It lasted only a second, but it was enough to notice that slight twitch in his face. I had wounded his pride. However, he regained his composure almost immediately and let out a mocking laugh. That doesn't matter. He leaned in close, a malicious grin on his face. You're going to fail this exam, and when that happens, you'll be mine. His words weren't just an empty threat. In this world, lower-ranking nobles could become the property of anyone with enough power to claim them. Fabius stepped back, his smile never wavering. Having a noble working for me, that will be truly gratifying. I stared at him silently for a few moments. and I couldn't help but think the same thing. I thought, since arriving in this world, people here talk too much and think too little. If I really wanted to become his servant, first, I would have to prove that he was smarter than me. And honestly, that was an experiment doomed to fail from the start. The discussion ended just as a heavy presence filled the room. Conversations died out instantly. A gray-haired man walked in, his hands clasped behind his back. He didn't need to raise his voice. His mere presence was enough to make everyone scramble to their seats. I sat down too, not because I was ordered to, but because I wanted to observe how this system worked from the very beginning. The professor swept his gaze across the room, as if he were sizing us up before we'd even begun. Finally, he spoke. "Good morning." His voice was firm. "I know many of you are nervous." He paused briefly as some students swallowed hard. "After all, if you pass this exam, you will have the privilege of entering the Magic Academy." Most of the students clenched their fists in excitement. I could see hope in their eyes, and that made me feel a twinge of pity, because they didn't yet understand the Academy's true purpose. The professor continued, "But before we allow you to learn magic, we must verify if you are truly worthy of that honor." He walked slowly between the desks. Then he smiled, an expression I didn't like one bit. "Today's exam is very simple." He paused again, and then he dropped the line that completely captured my attention. "Well, simple for a noble." The room fell into absolute silence. For those of you who weren't born nobles, it will be extremely difficult. Some students lowered their heads, others gritted their teeth. It was curious. Instead of motivating them, he was first destroying their confidence. A rather efficient technique if your goal was to create obedient people, not students capable of independent thought. Assistants began handing out the exam papers, one by one. I waited patiently until one landed in front of me. I looked down, and the moment I saw the first question, I couldn't help but smile. So this was the academic standard of the most prestigious school dedicated to magic. This was going to be far more entertaining than I had imagined. I glanced down at the first page of the exam. I couldn't help but let out a soft chuckle. Was that it? I had expected problems involving magical theory, complex calculations, or at least questions that required some actual reasoning. But this, it looked like a test designed for 8-year-olds. Most of the questions simply asked for concepts to be recited from memory. There wasn't a single one that tried to verify if the student actually understood what they were answering. It was exactly the kind of education that produces obedient people, not intelligent ones. I picked up my pen and started to write. One answer, another, and another. My hand barely paused. I didn't need to think. Each question vanished from my mind the moment I read it. While the rest of the room was still struggling with the first page, I was already finishing the last one. 5 minutes. That was all I needed. I set my pen down on the desk. I stretched slightly in my chair and looked over the exam one last time. Not a single mistake. I stood up. The sound of my chair sliding across the floor broke the absolute silence of the room. Everyone looked up at once. Some stopped writing. Others stared at me in utter confusion. Lilith's eyes widened in surprise. Fabius let out a soft laugh, convinced I had given up. Even the professor frowned as he watched me walk to the front of the room with the exam in hand. And judging by everyone's expressions, it was clear that no one could believe someone had finished so quickly. Although, to be honest, the real test for me was only just beginning. I walked up to the professor's desk with the exam in hand. I didn't say a word. I simply placed the papers in front of him. The professor looked up, his expression clearly annoyed. He likely thought I had given up, or worse, that I was trying to pull some kind of prank. He picked up the exam listlessly, but before checking a single answer, his eyes settled on the name written at the top, Adrián Valmont. His expression shifted completely. His eyebrows rose slightly. I could see him trying to place the surname, and a few seconds later, it clicked. Valmont. He's a noble. He looked me up and down again. Now it made sense. I was the only student in the room, wearing a uniform bearing the insignia of a noble house, even if it was one of the weakest in the kingdom. The professor let out a soft sigh. He had already found an explanation in his mind. Of course, to a noble, this exam must seem like child's play. After all, children of the nobility received a completely different education. While commoners barely learned the most basic reading skills, nobles grew up surrounded by private tutors and libraries. It stood to reason that one of them would finish first, or at least that was what the professor believed. However, there was something he still didn't know. I hadn't finished quickly because I was a noble. I had finished quickly because the exam was ridiculously simple, and I had a sneaking suspicion that the correct answers would surprise the professor far more than the speed at which I'd handed it in. From the back of the room, I could feel a gaze fixed on my back. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. It was Fabius. When he saw me handing in the exam so quickly, he grimaced in annoyance. For a moment, he looked genuinely confused. How the hell did he finish so fast? I could read that question written on his face. But that doubt didn't last long. His pride quickly found a much more convenient answer. Right, that idiot just wants attention. A mocking smile spread across his face again. He probably didn't even understand the questions. He gave up the moment he saw the exam. How pathetic. Human beings are curious creatures. When reality threatens their beliefs, they prefer to invent an explanation rather than accept that they might be wrong. Without saying a word, I left the room. The academy's vast hallway was completely empty. Everyone was still focused on taking the exam. Perfect. That meant I had time to do something much more interesting. Explore. I began to walk aimlessly, observing every detail of the building. The walls, the columns, the symbols carved into the stone, the windows. Every corner seemed to tell a story. I wasn't wandering out of mere curiosity. I was gathering information, because an academy dedicated to teaching magic always leaves clues about the true nature of that world. And I had a hunch that the most important secrets weren't hidden in books, but in the very structure of the academy itself. As I walked through the academy's corridors, I kept observing every detail of the place. The architecture, the symbols carved into the columns, the paths connecting the buildings. Everything seemed too perfect to have been built solely for educational purposes. Then, a presence caught my attention. At the far end of the corridor, a young man was walking with absolute composure. His uniform was completely different from mine. White, with gold embroidery and a dragon emblem on his chest. His black hair fell to his shoulders, and his eyes an intense shade of purple. Adrian's memories surfaced instantly. Victor, my distant cousin, a member of the powerful House Dragon, one of the most influential noble families in the entire kingdom. It was thanks to a single recommendation from him that I ended up studying at this academy, not because he wanted to help me, but because none of the academies reserved for nobles would accept me. To them, I was a disgrace to the aristocracy, and sending me off to be with the commoners was a polite way of getting rid of me. We kept walking toward each other until we stood face to face. Victor barely glanced my way. A faint smile appeared on his face. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who knew perfectly well that he was above everyone else. It's been a long time. Adrian. His voice sounded calm, but it was laced with an arrogance he made no attempt to hide. He didn't need to flaunt his status. His mere presence made it clear to anyone who was in charge. I watched him in silence, and I realized something immediately. If I wanted to discover how this world truly worked, I needed to start by understanding those at the very top. Hearing his voice was enough to understand the kind of person standing before me. Adrian's memories insisted on calling him a friend, but as I watched him speak, I reached a completely different conclusion. Victor had never been his friend. He was just someone who enjoyed feeling superior. Every conversation, every piece of advice, every smile, everything was carefully calculated to remind Adrian of his place. He wasn't trying to help him. He was looking for amusement, and Adrian had been his favorite toy for years. Curious, most people think they can hide their true intentions, but the body always speaks first. The way he held his chin, the slight tilt of his shoulders, the way his smile barely moved a few millimeters, it all pointed to the exact same thing: superiority. However, I knew how to smile too. I tilted my head slightly. "It's been a long time, Victor," he replied with an elegant smile. "I hear you're still trying to become a mage." Such admirable perseverance. He paused briefly before continuing. "If you truly wish to learn magic, I could teach you personally." His words sounded kind, but his eyes said something else. If I accepted, I wouldn't become his student. I would become a new form of entertainment. I smiled quite naturally. I'll keep that in mind, my good friend. For the first time, his expression shifted for just an instant. It was almost imperceptible, as if he had expected a different reaction, but he immediately regained his composure. I hope you make the right decision. We parted ways with a slight nod. Then we continued walking. He took the path leading to the Academy of Nobles. I followed the road to the Academy of Magic. Two paths, two completely different worlds, and I had the impression that sooner or later, those two paths would cross again. Only next time, the rules of the game would be very different. Victor kept walking without looking back. His stride remained elegant, confident, as if everything were under his control. But something kept bothering him. Adrián, he acted differently today. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't the way he dressed, nor his words. It was the look in his eyes. For the first time, he hadn't seen fear or admiration, not even a desire to please him. It was as if he were speaking to a completely different person. Victor smiled to himself. It doesn't matter. He'll still be the same old failure. Meanwhile, I kept walking through the Academy gardens with a faint smile. At first, I thought studying magic would be quite boring. After all, up until now, everything seemed based on memorizing things without understanding them. But the more I observed this world, the more questions arose. And where there are questions, there is always an opportunity to discover something new. Definitely, this was going to be much more fun than I'd imagined. 4 hours later, the exam finally ended. Students began to gather in front of the huge bulletin board. Some were praying, others could barely control their nerves, and a few tried to appear calm while staring fixedly at the door. A professor stepped out, holding a long list. Without saying a word, he pinned it to the board. For a second, everything went silent. And the next, the students rushed desperately to see the results. My gaze went straight to the top spot. First, Adrián Valmont. Exactly as expected. A little further down, I scanned the list until I found another familiar name. 10th, Fabius. For some reason, I had a feeling that ranking wouldn't please him at all. The students remained crowded in front of the results board. Some were celebrating, others were weeping, and a few simply stood in silence. However, there was someone whose expression was impossible to ignore. Fabius. His eyes were locked firmly on the top spot. Adrián Valmont. His face began to contort, little by little. Impossible. That makes no sense. He gritted his teeth so hard it looked as if he might shatter them. That idiot is completely useless. He doesn't even know how to count properly. How the hell did he end up in first place? His pride simply couldn't accept that reality. Ha! That was exactly the reaction I expected. When someone lives believing they are superior for too long, the truth tends to hurt far more than any defeat. While Fabius was still trying to find an explanation, I had already lost interest. After all, passing the exam was only the first step. The truly interesting part was about to begin. As evening fell, the instructors began organizing the students. Each student received a key and a dormitory number. Apparently, we would be sharing a room for the duration of our stay at the academy. I arrived at the assigned building. I slowly opened the door and found 3 young men who had already arrived before me. The first one immediately stood up to greet me. "Hello, I'm Robert." A friendly smile appeared on his face. Adrian's memories held no record of him, but a brief conversation was enough to understand who he was. The son of a merchant family, accustomed to negotiating rather than fighting. The second one remained seated on his bed. He was the youngest of the 4. He had a sword leaning against the wall, though judging by the way he looked at it, it was evident he didn't get along very well with it. Isaac, the son of the famous general who fought in the kingdom's wars of expansion. Everyone expected him to inherit his father's talent, but according to the rumors, he never managed to stand out as a swordsman, and that comparison haunted him every day. The last one looked up from a book. He calmly closed the volume before speaking. Lionel. His voice was calm and polite, the son of a royal administrator. Unlike the others, he seemed like someone who preferred to observe before acting. I glanced around the room once more. 3 strangers, 3 completely different stories. And for some reason, I had a feeling that living with them would be the first truly interesting experiment since I arrived in this world. As soon as I stepped through the dormitory door, I observed them in silence. There was no need to speak. People reveal a great deal about themselves before uttering a single word. My gaze went first to the boy smiling naturally. Robert. His posture was relaxed. His movements exuded confidence. And that smile? It didn't look forced. He was a cheerful person, charismatic, and far too polite for his age. He was definitely a merchant's son, accustomed to dealing with people from a young age. He knew how to make a good first impression. Then I observed the second one, Isak. He didn't even look up at first. His shoulders were slightly hunched. He was gripping the hilt of the sword resting by his bed, as if afraid to let go, but at the same time, as if he hated it. His eyes were filled with insecurity, and also with wounds that couldn't be seen. Without a doubt, he was someone who had given up on becoming a swordsman and had decided to try a new path with magic. Not because he loved it, but because he could no longer find anywhere else to belong. Finally, I turned my attention to the last one. Lionel, he wasn't smiling. He wasn't speaking. He was just watching me. His eyes followed my every move. Interesting. While I was analyzing my roommates, he was analyzing me too. He was definitely the type of person who thought before he spoke. At that moment, Robert broke the silence. He walked over with a big smile and extended his hand. "Hi, it's nice to meet you." I replied by shaking his hand. "The pleasure is mine." I looked at all three of them. "From today on, we'll be sharing this room. So, I hope we can get along." Robert nodded immediately. Isak gave a slight nod. And Lionel finally spoke. "Before that, what is your name?" I looked him straight in the eye. "Adrián Valmont." For a second, the room fell completely silent. Lionel's eyes widened in surprise. "Adrián Valmont?" He paused briefly before continuing. "Are you the student who took first place in the entrance exam?" A faint smile appeared on my face. The same smile that always appeared when something interesting was about to begin. "That's right. That is correct." And, judging by the way the three of them reacted, I got the impression that the conversation had just completely changed. That first night passed much faster than I expected. We ended up talking for hours. Robert was exactly as I had imagined. He always found a way to keep the conversation going. He had a natural talent for putting people at ease. Isak spoke very little, but when he did, you could tell he had lived through far more than someone his age should have to bear. Lionel, on the other hand, preferred to listen. Every now and then, he would ask a question. They weren't random questions. He was trying to understand how each of us thought. He was definitely quite intelligent. Without realizing it, that room began to feel less like a dormitory full of strangers and more like the beginning of a new team. The next morning, the first day of classes had finally arrived. The academy's hallways were packed. Everyone was hurrying along, looking for their assigned classrooms. I followed the building map until I reached a classroom on the top floor. I opened the door, and the moment I stepped inside, I understood how the classes were organized. It wasn't just any classroom. It was the special class. Only the students who had achieved the highest scores on the entrance exam were there. My gaze slowly swept across the room. Familiar faces. Some watched me with curiosity, others with obvious rivalry. And then I saw Lionel sitting by a window. When our eyes met, he simply nodded. So, he had made it in too. It didn't surprise me. I had known from the very first moment that he was highly capable. I chose a seat near the center of the room. I looked at the blackboard, the perfectly aligned desks, the huge windows flooding the room with light. And without realizing it, a smile appeared on my face. For a moment, I remembered my days as a student back on Earth. The labs, the classes, the experiments, the countless hours spent trying to answer questions no one else was asking. After all, perhaps becoming a student again wouldn't be such a bad experience. I was hoping for just one thing, that, at the very least, some professor at this academy would be able to teach me something I didn't already know. The classroom door flew open with a sharp bang. Conversations ceased instantly. We all turned our gaze toward the entrance. The man who had just entered commanded respect with his very stride. He had very dark skin, eyes that were completely black, hair pulled back into long braids that cascaded down his back. He wore an impeccable formal academy uniform. Every step was firm. His gaze swept across the room like a soldier inspecting new recruits. He didn't look like a teacher. He looked like a commander. He reached the desk. He set several books down on the table and spoke in a deep voice that filled the entire classroom. "My name is Sirius Black. He paused briefly. And for this year, I will be responsible for teaching you the fundamentals of magic. No one dared utter a single word. The professor clasped his hand behind his back and began to walk slowly between the desks. Before you open a single book, there are certain things you must understand. He stopped at the front of the room. Magic is a gift bestowed by the gods upon us, the nobility. Some students bowed their heads respectfully. Others listened in silence. I just kept watching. Without our guidance, none of you would be able to use that power correctly. That is why the nobility has decided to do you the honor of accepting you as apprentices. I noticed several students smiling proudly. They had heard those words repeated so often that they had come to accept them as absolute truth. The professor continued, as you all know, centuries ago, the Demon King attempted to destroy this world. Thanks to the sacrifice of our ancestors, humanity survived. He turned toward the huge map of the continent hanging on the wall. It showed vast areas marked in red. The beasts that still inhabit those lands are the last remnants of the Demon King's army. And you, he slowly pointed at the entire class, you will be part of that great feat. You will be the ones to carry on the fight to protect humanity. The classroom fell completely silent. Many students' eyes were filled with determination. It was evident that those words stirred their pride. I, however, couldn't stop thinking about something else. That whole speech sounded too perfect, too convenient. And when a story seems so perfectly constructed, it usually means that someone went to great lengths to hide the truth. Professor Sirius remained silent for a few seconds, as if ensuring everyone had understood his words. Then, he continued walking slowly between the desks. The nobility has granted you a privilege that very few receive. His voice remained steady. We have allowed you to receive the blessing of learning magic. Several students bowed their heads in gratitude. It was evident that those words had been repeated for generations. However, he stopped right in the center of the room. To use magic, you must serve a noble. Only a noble can guide you in awakening your magic veins. If any of you are unable to use magic, you will be immediately expelled from the academy. No one protested. No one asked questions. Everyone accepted those rules as if they were completely natural. I didn't, because something didn't add up. If the goal was to train mages, why limit access to knowledge? The professor returned to the front of the room. Very well. That concludes today's explanations. You may prepare to begin your classes. I slowly raised my hand. The whole class turned to look at me. Sirius did too. Yes? I looked him straight in the eye. What about the library? For an instant, the room fell completely silent. Some students stared at me as if I had asked an absurd question. Sirius remained motionless. Then he answered with perfect composure. The library is not a place you can enter. Not yet. That last word immediately caught my attention. Not yet? A faint smile appeared on the professor's face. It was the first one since the class began. Within the academy, there is a group known as the Guardians of Knowledge, the best students of each generation. They are charged with protecting this kingdom's most important books. He slowly turned toward a massive wooden door at the far end of the building, visible through the hall window. If any of you manages to pass the trial set by the Guardians, you will earn the right to enter the library and study all the knowledge preserved within. I couldn't help but smile. So there was a library filled with knowledge, and what's more, there was a test to gain access to it. Without a doubt, that had just become my first objective at this academy. Sirius positioned himself in front of the desk once more. There were still a few important matters to explain. There is one last rule you need to know. His voice brought silence back to the classroom. Studying at this academy isn't free. Some students exchanged worried glances. The professor continued, if you wish to stay here, you will have to work. He turned toward the huge board at the back of the room. Dozens of sheets of paper hung from it. In the common room, you will find all the job offers provided by this institution. Gathering materials, assisting in the laboratories, cleaning magical zones, capturing small beasts, and many other tasks. Each mission will earn you money and merit points. The more you contribute to the academy, the more opportunities you will have to keep growing. Now that sounded interesting. Learning magic while earning money. It was definitely far better than just attending classes. Sirius observed everyone's expressions. Then he smiled slightly. Right, since the explanations are over, I'll give you a quick demonstration. The whole class held its breath. The professor slowly raised his right hand. Magic isn't just about casting massive spells. True magic is controlling mana with absolute precision. He snapped his fingers. Snap! For an instant, absolutely nothing happened. Then, a small flame appeared, floating above the tip of his index finger. It was barely the size of a candle flame, yet it remained completely steady. Not even the wind blowing through the windows could extinguish it. The flame danced slowly, as if it were alive. A murmur rippled through the room. Incredible. That's real magic. How is it staying afloat like that? Some students rose from their seats without realizing it. Others watched with their mouths agape. That small flame had captured his entire attention. I watched it closely too. But it wasn't the fire that impressed me. It was the method. Because that flame, it didn't look powerful. It looked ridiculously efficient. And if there was one thing that always piqued my curiosity, it was discovering how things worked on the inside. Everyone remained captivated by that small flame. Some were still debating how it was possible. Others simply couldn't tear their eyes away from the fire. As for me, I could only think of one thing. How the hell does it work? I analyzed every detail, the temperature, the color of the flame, the movement. There was no fuel. There was no oxygen feeding a visible reaction. Nor could I see any mechanism that might explain its existence. I tried to find a scientific explanation, a hypothesis, any physical principle that could account for the phenomenon. But for the first time in a long while, I found no answer. And that made me smile. I couldn't suppress a soft chuckle. What a strange sensation. All my life I had chased the unknown. Every mystery eventually turned into a formula. Every phenomenon into a logical explanation. But this time, before me lay something I couldn't comprehend. Magic, a force completely alien to all the knowledge I had amassed over the years. I felt that thrill that only comes when you're on the verge of discovering a new world. Because if magic truly obeyed rules, then those rules could be studied, they could be understood, and eventually, they could be improved. I looked up at the small flame still hovering above Sirius's finger. A smile spread across my face. So this is magic. Perfect. Then I'll turn it into a science. And in that instant, I realized that this world was going to be far more entertaining than I had ever imagined. After classes ended, I headed straight for the common room. It was a much simpler building than the classrooms, but it was packed with students. Some were resting, others were eating, and most were gathered in front of a huge bulletin board. So that's where the jobs were posted. I walked over slowly, reading through the various offers. Alchemy assistant. Interesting. I could probably learn how they transform materials using mana. The next one. Cook. Not bad. After all, understanding a civilization's cuisine reveals a lot about it. I kept scanning down the list. Warehouse assistant. Inventory. Materials. Magical artifacts. That wasn't a bad option either. There were dozens of other jobs. Gardener. Messenger. Lab cleaner, mineral sorter. Each one offered a unique opportunity to learn about this world. But then, one notice completely caught my eye. Morgue assistant. A slow smile spread across my lips. Most people would probably avoid a job like that. But for me, it was essentially a laboratory. If I really wanted to understand this world, the first thing I needed to grasp was the human body, the magical veins, the flow of mana, the anatomical differences between the inhabitants of this world and humans from Earth. All of that had to leave traces, and there was no better place to investigate it than a morgue. While the other students looked for the most comfortable job, I had just found the most valuable one. Because science always begins the same way. First, you observe. Then, you understand. And only then do you start to change the world. I took the notice from the board, and following the academy map, I headed toward the morgue. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The path was completely empty. No other students were heading in the same direction. I suppose no one wants to work surrounded by corpses. After a few minutes, I arrived at a stone building set apart from the rest of the academy. It had no ornamentation, no large windows, just a heavy wooden door and a small, worn-out sign. Morgue. I pushed the door open. The interior was completely silent. It smelled of preserving herbs and disinfectants. Behind an old desk sat an extremely thin man. His skin was pale. He wore a long black robe. His eyes held an unsettling coldness, and his expression was so serious, one would think he had never smiled in his life. He barely looked up when I entered. "What do you want?" His voice was as dry as the air in the room. I looked at him calmly. "I'm here to work." The man frowned slightly. "The garden is at the back. They need help with the medicinal plants." He pointed down the hallway without even looking at me again. I took a small step forward. "No, I'm here to work. Here, in the morgue." The man remained motionless. For the first time, he lifted his head fully. His eyes swept over my student uniform, then my face, and finally back to my eyes. The silence grew awkward. Several seconds passed before he spoke again. "Wait." His expression, which until then had been completely cold, showed a hint of astonishment. "Did you say you came to work here?" He paused briefly. He looked around as if expecting someone to appear and say it was all a joke. Then he looked back at me. "At the morgue?" The man kept watching me for a few seconds. Then a faint smile appeared on his face. It was the first time his expression had changed. "Fine. If you really intend to work here, then let's see how long you last." He turned around and began walking into the depths of the morgue. I followed him in silence. We walked down a long corridor. On both sides stood old stone tables, shelves packed with jars of herbs, metal instruments, and thick, dust-covered books. Finally, he stopped. "For your first day, you won't touch any corpses." He tossed a wooden bucket, a brush, and several rags at me. "Your job is to clean this place. Tomorrow, I'll teach you how to properly care for a body." He finished speaking and let out a soft chuckle before walking away. The massive doors closed behind him. Now, I was completely alone. I slowly looked around. Ha! So this was the morgue of this world. It looked like something from centuries past. The tables were made of stone. The drains were simple channels carved into the floor. There was no modern sanitation system. And worst of all, everything was covered in dried blood. There were stains on the walls, on the tables, on the floor. Even some of the tools were still stained. The stench was unbearable. The dampness made everything seem even more unsanitary. I frowned slightly. No, this wasn't a morgue. It was a massive breeding ground for infection. If they really treated bodies this way, it was no wonder diseases spread so easily. I picked up the brush. A smile slowly spread across my face. I might have come here to learn anatomy, but before that, I would have to teach them something far more basic. Hygiene. Hours passed. Bucket after bucket, rag after rag, brush after brush. I didn't leave a single corner unchecked. The stone tables regained their original color. The tools were perfectly organized. The bloodstains vanished. I even opened all the windows to air out the place. The difference was so stark, it was hard to believe it was the same morgue. Just as I finished arranging the last instrument, the door opened again. The man in charge walked back in with his usual serious expression. He didn't even look up. "Well, I suppose you did your best." His voice remained completely indifferent. "Even so, I appreciate you deciding to work in a place like this." As he spoke, he began to walk around the room. Then, he slowly lifted his head. His body went completely still. His eyes swept over every corner of the morgue. The tables, the floor, the walls, the shelves. Everything was spotless. For the first time since I'd met him, his cold expression vanished. "You?" He fell silent for a few seconds. "You did all this?" I nodded calmly. "That's right." The man looked around the room again. He seemed unable to believe what he was seeing. A faint smile appeared on my face. I crossed my arms and answered with total confidence. "Now, this place is perfect for performing a dissection." The man in charge slowly turned toward me. The surprise on his face was evident, but it wasn't because of the cleanliness. It was because of that last word, dissection, as if he had just discovered that the student standing before him was no ordinary boy. Marvin stood completely motionless. His eyes swept across the room over and over again. The tables, the shelves, the floor, the tools. Everything gleamed. It seemed impossible that this was the same morgue he had left just a few hours earlier. Slowly, he raised his hand. He ran his fingers over one of the stone tables. There was no dust, no blood, not a single stain. His usually cold expression began to crack. Incredible. His voice was barely a whisper. I've been working here for years, and I never imagined this place could look like this. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the floor. The gray stones, hidden for years beneath layers of grime, had finally regained their original appearance. Marvin took a few more steps. He stopped in front of me. Tell me, how did you do it? He furrowed his brow slightly. Water alone never leaves this place looking like this. I smiled. It was a good question. While I was cleaning, I had been checking all the shelves in the morgue. Amidst forgotten jars and dust-covered boxes, I found several interesting materials. While exploring the place, I discovered they had some quite useful substances in storage. Marvin watched me closely. I mixed them in the right proportions and prepared a cleaning product. After that, it was just a matter of scrubbing. Marvin's eyes widened slightly. Cleaning product? I nodded calmly. Exactly. Some of those substances react with grease, dried blood, and other impurities. They just needed to be combined correctly. Marvin looked back at the floor. Then he glanced at the jars on the shelves. Then he looked back at me. For years, he had had all those materials right before his eyes, and it had never occurred to him that they could be used that way. I couldn't help but let out a soft laugh. Incredible. I thought I knew this place inside out, and yet a student came along to show me something entirely new. I couldn't help but smile. That was exactly what science was all about. It wasn't about having more strength or more talent. It was about observing what everyone sees and discovering a use that no one had ever imagined. Marvin kept staring at the bottle of cleaning fluid. He held it up to the light. He gave it a slight shake. Then he looked back at the morgue. It was clear he was still trying to wrap his head around how a mere student had transformed the place in just a few hours. Finally, he set the bottle down on the table. Adrian, his tone wasn't as cold as it had been when I first arrived. I'll take all this into account when I evaluate your work. I looked at him in silence. Marvin crossed his arms. In fact, I think having you clean floors would be a waste of your talents. Exactly the answer I'd been hoping for. People might ignore your words, but it's much harder to ignore results. Marvin walked over to a heavy metal door at the back of the morgue. He pulled a small key from his coat. You're getting a promotion starting tomorrow. He turned slightly toward me. You won't just be working as a cleaning assistant anymore. You'll be able to witness the autopsies of the monsters brought to this morgue. My eyes immediately darted toward the door. Monster autopsies. That was even better than I'd calculated. Up until then, I'd only known those creatures through Adrian's stories. Beasts born of mana, transformed animals, beings with organs capable of producing phenomena that didn't exist on Earth. And now, I'd have the chance to observe them from the inside. Their muscles, their bones, their monochores, and most importantly, the way that energy circulated through their bodies. I couldn't help but smile. Perfect. Marvin raised an eyebrow. He'd probably expected fear, or at the very least, some discomfort. But for me, this wasn't a room filled with corpses. It was a library written in flesh, bone, and organs. Each creature might hold a different answer, and if I managed to understand the anatomy of monsters, perhaps I would also find the first clues regarding how magic works. Marvin put the key away again. Show up tomorrow after class, and try not to eat too much before you come. He let out a dry laugh. I suppose he was trying to scare me. It didn't work. I gathered my things and left the morgue. The sun was already beginning to set behind the academy towers. As I walked toward the dormitories, I couldn't stop thinking about what I would see the next day. I had come to this place looking for information on the human body, and in less than a day, I had gained access to the anatomy of magical creatures. This job had turned out to be a 10 billion% correct choice. I kept walking until I reached the dormitory building. But when I opened the door to our room, I discovered that my roommates also had something important to tell me. And one of them seemed to have had a much worse first day than I did. I slowly opened the dormitory door. The first thing I saw was my 3 roommates sprawled out on their beds. Robert was lying on his back. He was breathing heavily while clutching his arms. I can't move them. Lionel was sitting on the floor. His back was against the bed, and his uniform was covered in dirt. Even Isaac, who usually tried to hide his emotions, looked completely exhausted. For a moment, I thought they had fought some kind of monster. But then Robert raised a hand. Adrián. His voice sounded so weary, like that of a dying man. Do you know how they treated us today? He shook his head and let out a sigh. They made us work like slaves. Lionel gave a short, bitter laugh. They promised us experience, but we ended up hauling boxes, cleaning stables, and moving materials all day long. Isaac closed his eyes. I don't think I've ever been this tired. The three of them looked like they had lost a war. I simply set my pack down next to the bed. Robert watched me curiously. And how did it go for you? I smiled. It was fun. All three of them looked up at once. Fun? I nodded quite naturally. Yeah, I learned a few interesting things. There was a brief silence. Lionel was the first to ask, Wait, what job did you end up with? I answered as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The morgue. The room fell completely silent. Robert's mouth dropped open. He seemed unable to speak. Isaac turned pale, and Lionel looked at me as if he'd just heard something insane. Are you serious? I nodded. Yeah. The three of them exchanged glances. Robert was the first to break the silence. They say that place is absolutely terrifying. Isaac swallowed hard. I heard even the professors avoid it after dark. Lionel frowned. And you actually liked working there? I couldn't help but smile. Sure, it's a really fun place. After all, it's not every day you get the chance to learn by observing things no one else wants to see. The three of them kept staring at me in total silence. And for the first time, they began to suspect that the student who had taken first place on the exam was far stranger than they had imagined. The next day, I returned to the classroom. As expected, Sirius was already waiting for us in front of the blackboard. As soon as the bell rang, the class began. He didn't waste time with speeches. He picked up a piece of chalk and began writing a series of strange symbols. They weren't letters, nor were they numbers. They were magical formulas. The whole class began copying them down quickly. Sirius set the chalk down on the desk. If you want to master magic, you must first understand that no spell appears simply by wishing for it. He turned toward us. Magic works through formulas. Every spell has a structure, an order, a meaning. If a single part of the formula fails, the spell will fail too. That immediately caught my attention. Formulas? Sirius drew a small magic circle on the blackboard. Several lines connected to form a rather complex pattern. Today, you will learn the most basic spell, fire magic. He walked slowly between the desks. To generate fire, it isn't enough to memorize the formula. You must also construct a perfect image in your mind. He raised a hand. Imagine a flame. Visualize its shape. Watch how it dances in the wind. Listen to the sound it makes. Now, feel its temperature, the heat on your skin, the energy consuming the air. His voice was so calm that many students closed their eyes to follow every instruction. Sirius smiled slightly. The more precise your imagination, the more stable the spell will be. Then he walked over to a table at the front of the room. Several candles rested upon it, all of them unlit. It looked as though they had been prepared before class started. Words can teach, but a demonstration always teaches better. He slowly extended his hand toward the candles. The entire classroom fell silent. I, too, was watching closely. I wasn't interested solely in the result. I wanted to discover exactly what was happening between that formula and the birth of the fire. Because if magic truly obeyed rules, then sooner or later, it could be described using the universal language of science. Sirius surveyed the entire class. The small flame continued to burn atop the candle. It wasn't a massive fire, but it was enough to teach the lesson. Many of you believe that magic depends solely on mana. He slowly shook his head. You are mistaken. He began to walk between the desks. Magical understanding. Asanas based on what you feel. He stopped beside one of the candles. Very well. Everyone observe the fire. Don't just look at it. Try to feel the heat. Imagine how it caresses your skin, how it consumes the wax, how it feeds on the air. The classroom fell completely silent. The students obeyed immediately. Many closed their eyes. Others slightly extended their hands toward the flame. I did the same, but for a completely different reason. Is this how this world works? I couldn't help but analyze every word the professor said. Was visualizing an element enough? Imagining a flame and feeling its heat? It seemed to me an overly crude way to control a phenomenon. On Earth, fire was the result of a chemical reaction. Fuel, oxygen, ignition temperature, everything obeyed perfectly defined laws. But here, it seemed the mind could replace those processes. I didn't have enough data to draw conclusions, and a scientist never rejects a hypothesis before testing it. So, for the moment, I would follow the teacher's instructions exactly. After several minutes, Sirius broke the silence. Raise your hand. Several hands began to rise. 1, 3, 5, then a few more. I observed each of those students. Interesting. So, not everyone was starting from the same point. That meant some had already awakened their magic veins before entering the academy. And if that was the case, then there was a method to do it. I just had to discover it, because once I understood the principle, magic would cease to be a mystery, and it would become just another branch of science. The hands that had been raised remained in the air. Sirius observed them one by one. Then he nodded slowly. Just as I thought, only a few of you have been authorized to use magic. That word caught my attention. Authorized. He didn't say capable, nor talented. He said authorized. Sirius walked over to his desk. He opened a small wooden chest and took out several thin books bound in dark leather. A magic circle was engraved on the cover of each one. The students who raised their hands already hold a contract with a noble. A murmur rippled through the classroom. Some looked at those students with admiration, others with envy. Sirius began handing out the books only to those who had raised their hands. From today on, you will receive this manual. Inside you will find the formulas needed to learn how to control basic magic. The students took the books as if they were receiving a treasure. One of them even clutched it to his chest. Sirius continued, "When this class ends, I expect to see you in the magic hall. That is where your practical training will begin. The rest of you must continue studying the theory until a noble decides to take you under their protection." The classroom filled with murmurs once again. I remained silent, but inside my head, all the pieces began to fall into place. So that was the true system. Magic wasn't restricted because it was difficult to learn. It was restricted because the information was carefully hidden. The formulas, the books, the practical training, everything was provided only after signing a contract with a noble. In other words, to learn magic, you first had to surrender your freedom. What an absurd system. Everyone in this world possessed magic veins. Everyone had the capacity to process mana, but the nobility had turned knowledge into private property. They didn't control magic. They controlled access to it, and that was far more dangerous. I looked at the books Sirius had just handed over. They didn't look special. They were simple manuals, information written on paper, and yet, the Academy treated them as if they were forbidden weapons. A slow smile spread across my face. If knowledge could be locked inside a book, then it could also be copied, studied, deconstructed, and reproduced. The nobles had built their entire power on a single idea that no one else could learn. But they had just made a mistake. They had let a scientist in to a world where knowledge was forbidden. Classes finally ended. As the other students left the classroom, I gathered my things and headed straight for the morgue. But the whole way there, I couldn't stop thinking about Sirius's lesson. Something didn't add up. According to the Academy, the only way to use magic was to receive a noble's blessing, to sign a contract, to submit to their authority, and only then could your magic veins awaken. No, that sounded far too convenient. If every inhabitant of this world possessed magic veins, then the capacity was already within their bodies. A noble couldn't create something that already existed. At most, they could trigger a process, unlock it, or teach a technique they kept secret. I kept walking, gazing up at the Academy's towers. Every book was restricted. Every practice session was monitored. Every formula remained under the nobility's control. That wasn't tradition. It was a system of power. A government seeking to keep the population under control would do exactly the same thing. It would convince everyone that power came from an elite. Then it would turn knowledge into a privilege. And finally, it would make people grateful to receive a small share of something that had always belonged to them. My lips slowly curled upward. That charade, I wasn't buying it for a second. There was no such thing as miraculous blessings. There was only a mechanism I didn't yet understand. And every mechanism, no matter how complex it seemed, had rules, variables, conditions, a cause, and an effect. I arrived at the door to the morgue. I placed my hand on the handle. All right, if the nobles think they can hide magic behind contracts and secrets, then I'll have to dismantle their entire system piece by piece. I opened the door. A smile appeared on my face. I will discover how to use magic. 10 billion%. And when I do, magic will no longer belong to the nobility. I arrived at the morgue right after classes ended. Marvin was already waiting for me. This time, there were no buckets or brushes. In front of him, a stone table covered by a sheet. You're just in time. He put on a pair of gloves. Today, you'll learn to dissect a goblin. He pulled back the cloth, and for the first time since arriving in this world, I was faced with undeniable proof. A green-skinned creature, long ears, jagged teeth. It wasn't human. It was a different species. So, I really was in another world. I stepped closer. The goblin was small, but its musculature was surprisingly dense. Marvin picked up a metal tool. Watch closely. The autopsy began. The skin was cut open. The muscles were revealed, the ribs, and finally, the organs. I felt no disgust, only curiosity. The heart, the lungs, the liver, the kidneys. Everything was very similar to the human body. Interesting. If it shared so many organs with us, perhaps there was a biological link. But then, I noticed the stomach. It was much larger. Its walls were thick. Marvin spoke. Goblins eat practically anything. Meat, bones, animals, even humans. I nodded. That explained their resilience. But something else caught my attention. A bluish vein ran across the torso. It wasn't connected to the normal circulatory system. I traced its path. It led to a small organ hidden behind the stomach. What is that? Marvin moved the tissues aside. Inside the organ, there was a small glowing stone. It emitted a faint light. My eyes widened. A stone inside the body? Marvin extracted it with a pair of forceps. It's a magic stone. I studied it in silence. It wasn't a foreign object. It was connected to the organ, and to that vein as well. In that moment, everything began to make sense. If that stone stored mana, and that vein distributed it, then I had just found the first real piece of the biological system of magic. I studied the magic stone held between Marvin's fingers. It glowed with a faint blue light, and the longer I looked at it, the more questions arose in my mind. I pointed to the goblin's bluish vein. What is this vein? Marvin shrugged. I don't know. I pointed to the small organ. And this one? No idea. I blinked. So, do you know how the magic stone forms? No. What does that vein carry? No. Why do all monsters have a stone? Marvin sighed. Adrián, I know how to open up a corpse, preserve organs, identify wounds, and determine how a creature died. But I'm not a magic researcher. So that was the limit. Marvin had mastered his craft, but he had never wondered how those structures worked. To him, the vein and the stone were just body parts. To me, they were pieces of a system no one had ever tried to understand. The dissection continued for a while longer. I memorized the position of the vein, the shape of the organ, but I found no answers. When we finished, Marvin covered the corpse. That's all for today. I nodded. I picked up my cleaning supplies. Thanks to the formula I'd prepared, the morgue was spotless again in just a few minutes. Marvin looked at the result. You're getting faster. Efficiency comes when you stop repeating bad methods. Marvin chuckled softly. I put the materials away, but I remained unsatisfied. I had found a magic vein, an unknown organ, and a stone capable of storing mana, but I still didn't understand how they worked. Corpses could show me the structure, but not the process. I needed a different kind of evidence, a living creature, an experiment, or information the nobility had kept hidden. I said goodbye to Marvin and left the morgue. There was still some light left. Instead of returning to the dormitory, I headed toward the academy gardens. If I wanted answers, I would have to stop looking only among corpses. Plants were alive too, and in a world filled with mana, it was impossible for them not to have some connection to magic. I walked among trees and medicinal herbs. Then I knelt before a plant that was emitting an almost imperceptible glow. A smile appeared on my face. Maybe the next clue was never inside a monster. Maybe it had been growing right beneath my feet all this time. I stopped in the middle of the garden. Dozens of unfamiliar plants grew all around me. Some had transparent leaves, others emitted a faint glow, and a few seemed to move even without the wind. I crouched down in front of a flower with bluish petals. I examined it closely. I don't recognize any of these species. Those plants seemed to have evolved under completely different rules. While examining a leaf, I heard a voice behind me. "Are you lost?" I turned around. Standing before me was a woman with green hair and emerald eyes. She was dressed like a teacher and carried a basket full of herbs. Not exactly. I pointed at the plants. I wanted to know what makes them special. The woman blinked. She gazed at the garden for a few seconds. I suppose. Duh, it's the beauty they offer. I looked at the flowers. Then I looked at her. Wow, that's far too superficial. Her expression shifted between surprise and annoyance. That wasn't the answer I expected. I crouched down again. So, what kind of plants are they? The teacher adjusted her basket. They're medicinal plants. Most are used to brew potions. That grabbed my full attention. Potions? She nodded. Healing ones. Antidotes. Mana boosters. Physical enhancers. Each plant possesses different properties. I looked at the garden again. So, they weren't just simple flowers. They were raw materials. Substances capable of altering the body. A smile spread across my face. The potions in this world couldn't be miracles. They had to work through chemical reactions or through some interaction between their components and mana. And just when I thought that garden would only give me a single clue, I ended up finding an entire laboratory growing right before my eyes. I examined the plants again, more closely. If they were all used to brew potions, then their properties had to be far more specific than they appeared. I turned toward the teacher. What kind of potions can be made from these plants? She adjusted the basket in her arms. Then she pointed to a flower with red petals. The plants in this garden possess magical properties. Each species holds a distinct essence. She leaned down and carefully touched one of the leaves. Some contain an essence capable of accelerating wound recovery. Others can help replenish spent mana. Then she pointed to a plant with thick stems and dark leaves. There are also species that temporarily strengthen the body. They boost strength, endurance, or reduce fatigue. I listened to every word without interrupting. So they weren't merely medicinal plants. They were organisms capable of storing specific magical effects. The teacher smiled. That is why they are so valuable. They aren't usually used for attacking, but they serve as excellent support for mages, soldiers, and adventurers. Healing potions, mana restoratives, physical enhancers, antidotes. It all depended on the plant used, on the skill of the person brewing the potion. I rested a hand on my chin. Interesting. If each plant produced a different effect, then there had to be a substance responsible for it. A compound, a structure, or perhaps a specific form of mana stored within their tissues. I looked at the garden again. Those plants weren't just simple ingredients. They were tiny, living laboratories. And if I could discover how they stored their magical properties, perhaps I could also understand how the body stored and utilized mana. A smile slowly spread across my face. The answer I was seeking might be much closer than I imagined. After hearing her explanation, I looked at the plants again. Healing, mana recovery, strength enhancement. Too many properties to attribute solely to something as vague as magic essence. I needed samples. I turned toward the teacher. "Can I take some?" She blinked. Then she looked at the basket she was holding. "Some plants?" I nodded. "Yes. I only need a small amount of each species." The teacher watched me curiously. "What do you plan to use them for?" I carefully picked up a bluish leaf and examined it against the light. Its veins emitted an almost imperceptible glow. I'm curious about them. I want to analyze them. For a few seconds, the teacher said nothing. Then a smile appeared on her face. "If that's the case, you can use the botany lab." She pointed to a small building at the back of the garden. It had large windows, and several work tables were visible from the outside. You'll find containers, scales, mortars, and some basic instruments there. That was exactly what I needed. The teacher began placing several plants into a smaller basket. A red flower, a blue herb, and a yellow plant with a thick stem. Then she handed it to me. "You're a very curious boy. I like that. She smiled sincerely. I took the basket. Curiosity is the only thing that keeps a person from accepting mediocre answers. She let out a soft laugh. Perhaps she wasn't used to hearing something like that from a student. I said goodbye and started walking toward the lab. As I walked, I looked at the samples again. If those plants could truly alter the body, then their properties should be measurable, separable, comparable, and reproducible. I wasn't going to settle for just brewing a potion by following a recipe. I wanted to know why it worked, which substance brought about the healing, which structure stored the mana, and which component boosted strength. I opened the laboratory door. A smile spread across my face. Finally, a place where I could stop listening to theories and start experimenting. I entered the botany laboratory with the basket in my hands. The place was already occupied. Several students were working in silence. Some were grinding leaves in mortars. Others were heating small vessels over magical flames. And a few were mixing colored liquids, following instructions written on old parchment. I paused at the entrance. I observed every table, every tool, every method, and I reached a conclusion quite quickly. This place was far too primitive. There were no magnifying lenses. There were no precision measuring instruments. There were no mechanisms to control the temperature. They didn't even have standardized containers. Everything depended on the experience of the person working, on their intuition, and probably on luck. It was hard to get reliable results that way. I walked over to an empty table and set the basket down. I took out one of the plants. It was the bluish herb that, according to the teacher, could help restore mana. I picked up a small blade. I carefully separated a leaf. Then I slowly opened up the stem. I didn't want to destroy any important structures. I examined the fibers, the sap, the tiny veins running through the interior. Everything looked normal at first glance. Too normal. I frowned slightly. I need to see more. I brought the sample closer to my eyes. I tried to make out any distinct tissue, any crystals, any accumulation of mana, but I couldn't see anything in enough detail. I sighed. A microscope. That was exactly what I needed. A tool capable of showing me what the human eye couldn't see. Cells, ducts, deposits, perhaps even the way that plant stored its magical essence. I looked around the laboratory. Mortars, knives, flasks, candles, tools sufficient for mixing ingredients, but not for understanding them. A smile slowly spread across my face. Fine. If this world didn't have a microscope, then I would have to build one, because I had no intention of stopping my research just because the technology here was centuries behind. These videos come entirely from my imagination. Every story, character, and world is an original idea that I develop little by little. If a particular story really resonated with you, please let me know in the comments. That way I'll know which ones are worth investing more time and energy into developing further. And if a story doesn't quite hit the mark, I'll create a new one based on an even more interesting idea. Ultimately, you decide which worlds deserve to keep growing. See you in the next video.